series.
Hey, we're back after 2 weeks off. We're back.
Good
Back from the
evening.
feast. Had a couple of whole days to rest up and get back to work, but we made it back.
Same here.
So, all right. So tonight we're going over part 2 of Moses. We started part 1 a few weeks back, and this will be a little further on, a little more comparison to his life and Jesus Christ's life, and the symbolism there. So, Dr. X, if you'd like to take us out.
Glad to be here this evening. Once upon a time, there was a king who wanted to go fishing with the queen. So he asked the royal scientist, who was their forecaster, he says, is it going to be rain today? And the forecast said, I'm a meteorologist, and I study the heavens, and there's no chance of rain. It was in the morning. So the king and the queen are riding out to their fishing pond, and a farmer comes riding on a donkey. And the farmer says, Your Majesty, why are you out heading fishing on a day when it's going to be a terrible rainstorm? And the king says, well, my royal forecaster says there will be no rain. The farmer says there will be rain. And he says, well, who should I believe, my royal forecaster or you, a farmer? So, of course, the king wrote on. Needless to say, there was a torrential downpour. As they got back to the castle, they fired their weather scientist, called for the farmer. He came before the king. He said, I want to hire you as my new weatherman. Be a good salary for you. And the farmer says, I know nothing about weather. Well, how did you know it was going to rain? My donkey, he knows. And he twitches with his ears and lets me know when it's going to rain. So the king decided that he would hire the donkey. So began a practice of hiring the alternative name to donkeys to work in the government in the highest and most influential positions until this very day. They didn't get the alternative name for donkey, right? We're trying to be nice. Look at DC. Okay, here's a I think Kelly got it. Oh, he got it. Okay, this is a short one. This is called You Fool. The boss in the office gets a note, and the note was a letter. But the letter, all the letters said in big bold letters, you fool. So he sat on it all weekend. That Monday he addressed the staff. He says, you know, I've often gotten letters from people, often unsigned. But this week I received a letter from someone who signed it but forgot to put a letter in. Well, today we're going to look at lessons we can learn from the life of Moses, kind of the big picture, the final picture. Because Moses is such a great man in the Bible, I think it's hard to maybe to put him in one only. So we're going to pick up a little bit where we left off in part 1, then expand it. If you notice, Deuteronomy 18:15, I'll read it again. Jehovah, your God, will raise up for you, speaking to the people of Israel, a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren, him you shall hear. And then if you go to Acts 3:22, 3:23, quotes that scripture almost verbatim and applies it to Jesus Christ. Obviously, the people of the Jewish people there in Jerusalem on the first Pentecost would have high regard for Moses. And he's saying this man is the one that is going to come as a type of Moses, and that you must listen to this man who's Jesus. And of course, and that started the conversion of thousands of people into Christianity. But the fact that Moses is on that comparable level, also he and Christ were both feared as deliverers of their people. So evil kings, Pharaoh and Herod, tried to kill them as babies. And that's another parallel between the two. And as we said earlier, Moses was rescued by the best place he could be rescued, Pharaoh's daughter. Mm-hmm. So it all worked out. But I wanted to make a statement here, and then we'll turn it over to our other brilliant young panel members who are worried about people thinking they're older than they are. I shaved off my gray hair. That's a smart thing. At any rate, but your gray hair looks good on you, Kelly.
Yeah.
Or salt and pepper. At least I take that back. Salt and pepper. Therefore, we can conclude that there are no contradictions or clashes in the writings of God inspired of Moses and Jesus Christ, because Christ was the God in the cloud that talked to Moses. I realize that Moses led a theocracy, and our church is not a theocracy, so you have to know how to apply some things that are written in the books of the law. But there's no fundamental contradiction between Moses and Christ, and a lot of the world is deceived on that point. Let's say the obvious. I know a certain person said, you're always telling people the obvious, but let's say the obvious. No one really disagrees with the Ten Commandments except for two, and the big one is the Sabbath. We all agree?
Yes.
That's the only reason they want to challenge Moses. Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, in today's society, I mean, the modern religion, I guess you want to call it that, they tend to hold to the New Testament. But the New Testament itself, you know, just as St. Peter there said that, you know, Moses talked about Christ. Well, you know, in John 1, you know, it tells us that Christ was the one that did the creation, that Christ is the God of the Old Testament. Then in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, it says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if Jesus Christ is the same, and he's the God of the Old Testament, then there can't be any contradiction, because he was the one that laid down the law and gave the law to Moses.
One of the things that helped me when I was coming to church early, it took a while to tumble to it, but there's no vigorous defense of the Sabbath or the annual Sabbaths in the New Testament. The reason there's no vigorous defense of it, it was never an issue. They always had the Old Testament to go back to basic rules. Now, Paul had to talk about the administration of certain things, but now they had a big battle over circumcision, and that may fool people. Why doesn't the Bible have a big fight over the Sabbath and the holy days? Because it was, no one dared question it. It was almost like challenging thou shalt not murder. You know, there's no defense on thou shalt not murder because it's obvious.
Right.
Any thoughts?
Well, back to a couple of things. Christ, most of the time when he talked about the different apostles and things, he'd say, unless you're like Moses and the apostles, he would separate Moses out, because Moses brought the law back to knowledge of men. Moses is who he gave it to write it down. But several places, and I read this a couple weeks ago, Colossians 1:16, for by him all things were created that were in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominations, principalities or powers or things created all things were created through him. So there's no arguing. If you want to take your New Testament and you want to say, well, all this Old Testament stuff was done away with, and Moses, Moses was mean because he wrote all these rules and laws. Well, read the New Testament. Do away with the Old Testament for a minute. Read the New Testament and write what they say about Christ. Write what they say about what he said about Moses. Hebrews 10. My wife lost my glasses, so I'm winging it. Why does everybody laugh about that? I can prove it. Where are my glasses? She doesn't know. Hebrews 10 and verse 28. Anyone who's rejected Moses' law dies without mercy on the testimony or two or three. So they will read everything about this, gather together, all the things that lead up to this, not forsaking, verse 25, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as in the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much more as you see the day approaching. It goes on and on and on. But they'll stop when they get to 28, where it says, anyone who has rejected Moses' law. Well, who wrote this? Paul. Did Paul know Christ? Absolutely. And Paul didn't have any reason to change anything and any reason to beat up the Sabbath or those things, because it was pretty much the law of the land. Everyone did it. So you didn't have to beat that up. Everybody knew. If you take a look also at Moses, there was, I don't know, 6 months or a year ago, I was thinking about putting together something. Moses was offered a kingdom. And Jesus Christ, Satan came to him and says, look out as far as you can see, I'll give this to you. The parallels are just amazing between the two of them. Moses was God's spokesman to Pharaoh, to the king of Egypt, or the king of sin. Christ was a spokesperson to all carnal people. He was the Logos in John 1. So the parallels are quite a bit. But I love when I read and Christ talks about, unless you heed the word of Moses and the prophets, Moses and the apostles. He separates Moses an awful lot. I think that looking back at Moses as the Logos, in a sense, the representative of Christ at that time, and probably the only man on earth with God's Holy Spirit at that time, it's quite, when Christ was here, who else had God's Holy Spirit guiding them?
And I want to just mention this, and we can all kick it around, but Moses saved all the Israelites, which could include we believe, the ancestors of the 3 Jewish tribes and the other, I guess, 9 tribes, other 10 tribes. Moses saved them by one prayer in the desert. And if we go to Numbers 14, actually, if you read the whole thing from 10 to 20, you get the full story of it. It's hard to pick out maybe the best part to read at this point, but I'm going to read verse 11. But remember, this is the Israelites had tested God 10 times. Every test God gave Israel, they failed. For instance, at one point, they had to go up a rocky mountain there, kind of rugged roads for 3 days. They complained that it was too hard, and they wanted to stone Moses and go back to the life in Egypt. I know that sounds weird, but that's another time they said, we got to have meat, like fried chicken, roasted pheasant, and they complained and wanted to do away with Moses again. And the same when they had shortage of water. Every time they always turned on Moses, and God was, when they wouldn't go into the promised land because they didn't trust God, God said in 14:11, then Jehovah said to Moses, how long will these people reject me? How long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? I will strike them with pestilence and disinherit them. And then the next couple of verses, Moses gives a prayer which changes God's mind. It's a remarkable prayer, and what the people tried to stone Moses and Aaron again, and yet he intervened for them.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, isn't it kind of crazy? Jump forward 4,000 years, and some of us are the same way. Um, you can be shown the way to everything, and you can't get your I wants out of it. The carnal mind is still the carnal mind.
Mhm.
I thought about the same thing. You think about the fact that they were there, they seen everything, they seen the parting of the Red Sea, they seen all the miracles, and still they fell into it. And then you could. It's easy for us to think, well, how crazy was that they did that? But then the more you think about it, the more you think, well, we do the exact same thing.
Yeah,
That was
we
their
do.
symbolism for sin in their time. I mean, they were committing sin every time they do that. Well, every time we commit sin after baptism, it's the same thing.
Yeah, and it's always amazing that you can sit down and talk to people and say, has God ever performed a miracle in your life? Or has God ever answered a prayer for you? And they'll say, oh, well, yes, this he answered this prayer, or he did this, or he intervened here, or he helped me out here. And yet, when a new trial comes up, they forget about that, and it becomes the same thing. Will God answer? Will God take care of me? Will. And he's like, how many times does he have to show you? How many times does he have to show us that he answers our prayers and that he takes care of us, that he always does what's best for us? I hear people talking about, looking back in hindsight when, you didn't get the prayer that you thought you would get, or the answer you thought you would get, and then on down the road when you look back, you're thankful that you didn't get the answer to your prayer because you realize God did what was best for you. And still, when things happen, it's like we go back to he's not done anything for us at all, and we forget what he has done for us, and we lose that trust, that faith, and that's what Israel constantly did, and they were seeing great miracles.
I
You got to
think
understand.
that's the. I'm sorry. I think that's the lesson. Is we're so short-sighted. They were short-sighted. It wouldn't be very long before they'd see a miracle and then they'd fall right back into sin. And we do the same thing. We let the
Hmm.
world yank us right back out of where we know we should be because we're so short-sighted um, that we let it we forget so fast what we've got and what has been done for us that we fall right back into the same trap. Granted, we weren't standing there when this giant water walls of water was standing there, but it doesn't have to be that. It's just as bad.
Hmm.
It's I'm being a little silly with this, but it's the analogy. Like when I was little, I'd go to my big sister and say, I hurt my thumb. So she'd stomp on my foot and say, there, think about that for a while. Um, it's always right now. It's always right now. You forget about everything else for the right now.
Hmm.
And my sister really did those things.
At least you didn't try to drown your sister a few days ago.
Not on the air. I won't discuss it. But that the thing is, we get the I wants and we forget about what's really important. And then when you're elderly and you realize you hurt something, or you're going to have a major surgery, or the doctor tells you this is suddenly the only thing important now is having a relationship with God. If you started out 40 years before that, maybe that now wouldn't be such a big deal, because now you develop that relationship, and you know him better. He definitely knows you, and that changes everything, I would think.
That's a good point, David, about the relationship. Uh, Moses had such a great relationship with God. I think he knew when he said, if you don't spare the Israelites, take my life too. He knew God would not do that. And also he knew how God thought too. But those Israelites were very unappreciative of what God did for them.
But they came from 430 years of absolute nothing, and they became their captors. And Moses, his hands were so full. I was thinking about him today, about what he must have gone through going in, loving these people, loving God. And he was 80 when he started doing this. 40 years he walks them in the desert, and he doesn't get to go into the promised land. But what he got was, he got to walk to the edge and look and have hope. God left him with hope, because he looked in the promised land and he said, this is a new generation. The others, are gone. These are their children. And he had hope through Aaron and the Levitical priesthood that God would build this mighty nation of his family, his blood, from his work. And so Moses died a very satisfied man looking at the promised land. And I said in my sermon that I gave at the feast, I feel kind of backwards from that. I feel like I was born and raised in it. We're watching it go away. We have a different hope. Our hope is that Christ returns for us, because we're headed right back to the slavery that God was so loving and kind that took the children of Egypt out of, and he took us out of when he built this country. I don't have that same hope looking at what's going on around me today.
Yeah, I can sure understand that. Moses had a great attitude of love for people who didn't appreciate Moses either.
Well,
By the way, go ahead, Dave.
He had murder attempts. He had people that wanted to stone him and things. I mean, he didn't have it easy. The people he was fighting for were after him.
If you think of the character it takes to put yourself on the line for people, at least a good deal of them, not all, were backstabbing and trying to get rid of him.
And then still have the character to be able to pray to God and say, forgive them for what they're doing, overlook it, and let's move forward with your people.
But again, isn't that what Christ did?
Mm-hmm.
Forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Exactly.
I think it was Stephen did the same thing, prayed for the people that killed him. I got to tell you, I don't see that in me an awful lot. Cut me off in traffic and see what happens.
Yeah, that's
something. Go ahead.
That's part of that. That's part of that spiritual growth that we have to have. I mean, we all have that little bit of Israel in us that wants to turn on God and do things that we shouldn't do and show a lack of appreciation. But that's where, we're supposed to continuously grow to where we overcome those things and grow more towards like Christ, which also is growing more towards like Moses and the way he handled things.
My dad says the average overstreet male, so I'm putting this on my brothers, can't think till we're 30. And then he says we've got 60 or 70 years of the conversion process, which now puts us at 90 to 100. So, and then someone comes along and loses your readers.
It'll be a long night over there, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know what? If she wasn't my best friend, I couldn't get away with that.
Yeah, well, we'll
See,
see if you're on this week if you can get away with it or not.
Yeah.
See, I'm thinking right now that she is forgiving you.
I'm helping with her spiritual growth.
Put that word for you. But something you said, Dave, that sparked something. A lot of people ask, well, I mean, obviously God, the Israelites got on Moses' nerve, and he kind of spoke out of turn because they kind of got to him, which is humanly understandable. They said, why didn't God let him go to the promised land? I was thinking about what you said. He died a satisfied man, having gotten them there with the younger generation. And he got, his successor prepared. Everything was going to go well. And I'm sure he knew it. I think God didn't send him over for another good reason. Because Joshua's role was that of conqueror, which was a bloody task of eliminating 7 Canaanite nations. And it's pretty bloody stuff. Moses didn't really, I'm not saying Moses couldn't have done it. He could have probably done it, even at 120, they said he was strong physically. He could have done it, but I think God would prefer for his role to be the lawgiver. And I mean, obviously that's not doctrine, but that's an opinion. So he won't be looked at so much as the one that erased and eliminated those Canaanite nations. The warrior king, that's more for his replacement, Joshua. But I think Moses' role as lawgiver is a better role. And that was a bloody task in what Joshua had to do. In other words, God used Israel to eliminate 7 very evil nations. But even still, I think plus 40 years of dealing with the Israelites is enough. Don't you agree? Another 40 years, that must be too much.
Yeah.
So it was a blessing. It's like sometimes if you lose a really bad employer, you think, oh, how bad it is, and then you feel so good when you're away from them for a while.
Well, also it says Moses was the most meek and humble man, and in that humility and that meekness, it may have been more out of character for him to have continued on, and what he'd already gone through. He watched the greatest nation fall, and in maybe partially in his mind it was due to some of his hand, because God used him. God put the spirit in Moses that brought down the Pharaoh, the most powerful army, the most powerful nation that had ever been.
Yeah, I think it's an example of God can do anything God wants to do, but I think He uses people with certain talents to accomplish certain things. And when they accomplish what it is that they need to do with those talents, then He brings someone else along with a different talent to accomplish something different, which I think is what was going on here. I mean, it was a different thing that was going to need to be done, and Joshua came along, and he had a different talent than Moses, and so that's what was used. And I think it goes all the way down through the biblical history. You can see where different people with different talents were used for different positions. And I think it goes on today too. I think there's times when one talent is needed to accomplish one goal, and another talent is needed to accomplish another goal, and you use those together to accomplish God's work.
And personalities.
Everybody can be a
Yeah,
hand
that's
or a
personality.
eye
Yes.
or
Yeah.
Everybody has their own purpose.
When you read about the apostles, you read a little bit about their personalities. I think Paul was humble and probably more reserved. Peter was much more rambunctious and spontaneous, and they're different personalities, but they were called to do different things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I've always said that I think that there's people that when I give a sermon that will pick up on things that someone else won't who is listening to Dr. Ricks. I mean, we have different styles, and I think we reach different people. I think it's why the ministry is so diverse, that God uses all those different personalities and characteristics to reach everybody.
Well, and people understand. They you can hear one person and you understand them better. I had somebody come to me that's been in the church a very long time this feast, and they said they really appreciated Mr. Griffith's sermon. He said, I never thought about this statement that he made, which to me was a statement that I got, several years back, a long time ago. He said, I never really thought about it. When Mr. Griffith said, and I'm not going to go into what it was, but he said this, he goes, that's when it hit me. I am doing what I'm supposed to do. That is what God expected. And I'm sure he's heard other ministers say it, but when Mr. Griffith said it, it hit something with this man. And so that's why he does the things he does. So Moses did what he had to do, and how much harder can you work the man? That man worked. Before he was called out of Egypt, apparently he was quite respected and expected to accomplish an awful lot, because the one scripture said that Pharaoh considered him a god. He must have been a very brilliant, hard-working, disciplined man to have accomplished the things he did before God took him out into the wilderness and then brought him back into Egypt to conquer it. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing when you look at us. We've been called out of the world. We still live in the world. Yet now we are trying as ministry to fight against it. Nowhere near on the level of Moses.
Right.
But we're doing our part on an individual basis to set the example, to give them knowledge and make them think.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, there's one part of Moses, a lesson from Moses that's really big. We kind of hit on it, was that Be gracious to your enemies, love your enemies. I mean, that's what Christ said in Matthew 5, to love your enemy. But Moses set a great example. Many of those Israelites plotted, as you said, a number of times tried to kill him, and yet he prayed for them and he saved them.
Yeah, it says when you pray for your enemies, it's like leaping hot coals upon their head. You know, you don't think as a carnal individual, a human being, you don't think like that. You think I just want to leap coals on their head.
Yeah.
You know, but when you pray for them and you let God handle it.
Nice to them, being gracious to them, showing them love when they're not showing you that's leaping. That's it burns them up when they can't get to you, and you're just being nice as you can to them. It makes them look bad in the eyes of others as well.
Again, I think it's a matter of your showing faith too, because God says He'll take care of those things. We don't have to get revenge because God will take care of it. If vengeance needs to be taken, then God will take it. It's not up for us to do it. So again, it's us trusting God's word that He'll take care of situations. He'll take care of people, thorns in our side, people who are causing us problems. Then He's able to take care of it, and we have to have that faith to believe what He's told us. Again, not be like Israel and want to take it upon ourselves and ignore all the miracles we've had in our life and take care of these things ourselves. And plus, part of it is part of more of our growth. If we can just set it aside and pray for those people who cause us harm and problems, and let God take care of it.
Doing that brings out the best in us. Acting revenge on people brings out the worst in us. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's got a real good chance of getting us in trouble by acting vengeance on people.
Vengeance is blasphemy, because Christ said, vengeance is mine alone. If we take that, we're trying to steal something from Christ.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good point.
Good point. That's a good point.
I thought so.
Plus, there's just so much effort involved.
One tactic.
It's just easier to give that to someone
else. I'll be honest, I am so tired. I'm hearing it when you hear it. I had 10 days worth of work to catch up on it, too.
And that's
what we're in good spirits today. They say one method, when people raise their voice and scream at you, try to keep your voice at a normal, low, indoor tone, and it may eventually calm them down.
Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath.
Mm-hmm.
I've noticed when people start getting more excited, you start getting more and more excited, it doesn't always help. Maybe at a football game, that's great, get everybody's energy up. But I was thinking about a guy gave me a real hard time the other day, and I've got all these little answers I could give back that would not necessarily be edifying. And thinking about the old expression, never argue with a fool, because if a stranger walks up, he can't tell who was who. And so the guy gave me a hard time, and I just went, I'm not going to change what he thinks. So I just shut up and let him run his mouth, and it stopped. It was done. But had I continued, then it would have continued, and then it would have gotten louder, and everything would have escalated. So I just went, that's what you think. I was done with it.
Yeah.
And a couple people standing by after it was done, came over and said, I think you're right.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, they did a wonderful play at the feast over my wife and Sharon Cates and Ramona Curlin did a wonderful play at the feast. And in the feast, this is based on Moses and the Israelites, there was one group with red and black tents called the malcontents, and another group with blue and green tents who were the Goodmans. The good sons. And the whole point of the play was, if anything went wrong, all the malcontents never trusted God. All they did was complain. When you read much of the writings of Moses, you get the impression maybe 80% of the Israelites were in the malcontents. I'm going to read 14:2. Numbers 14:2. And all the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt. Then they elaborated. That statement you'll find many, many times in the Pentateuch, those first 5 books of the Bible. They always complained and grumbled. And the thought I'm thinking is the lesson that we can learn from that is when we are in a challenge or a test, don't be the malcontents. Show some trust in God.
Yeah, I think that when you take the view of the malcontent, I think that's the process of hardening your heart, because you're hardening your heart against God. That He's put you in this. I mean, saying like we've been better off if He just left us where we were at and just let us die in Egypt instead of bringing us out here. They had hardened their heart against God and all that He had done for them, and so that complaining, that murmuring, was starting to harden their hearts against God, which is ultimately what kept them out of the promised land, was because of the way they behaved.
Well, the scripture, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. They obviously, if I had seen this God of Moses do all of the things he did in Egypt, open the Red Sea, destroy Pharaoh's army, I would be so afraid to say anything. If he said, listen, this is what you got for dinner, you got manna, you got crickets, or whatever, I'm not going to argue with that, because I would, if he brought down the greatest country, the nation, the people, everything that was great, and open the sea while I walk through, then drown their army. I get a little chicken from somebody with that kind of strength,
Yeah.
How easy it is to forget.
Yeah. Again, I think human nature plays a point in it, because really, God gave them all this, and there was no appreciation. It's the way it is today. When people are given things, they don't appreciate it. And people who are given things with no cost tend to complain more about it than people who actually have to make an investment or purchase it, or they buy it. Then they seem to appreciate it more than people who are just given it, who it's given to.
I had a guy walk up to me with a gas can years and years ago in a parking lot, and he said, "Hey, my car ran out of gas, and I just got to get X number of miles from here. Could you help me out?" I said, "Which car is yours?" And he pointed some little tiny car. So I handed him $1. He goes, "That's the best you can do." I said, "Give it back." Give it back. So I saw him 4 hours later walking down the road with that can. No, I'm kidding. He kept $1.
I was going to be.
Gas was only $1.50 a gallon. That car was getting 30 miles a gallon. He had to go 5 miles. $1 would have done it easy.
Yeah.
But it was used
You know what? That is a standard way people beg for money. They come up to you in your parking lot, tell you they ran out of gas. Sometimes they tell you their child's in the car. I've heard that same story. It's like there's a script for it. I've heard that same story several times, traveling throughout where I do. But yeah, it seems to be a standard script. So if you hear that, chances are there's no car, no kid, and gas is not an issue.
I saw him in a different parking lot later that same day. There was a series of books that came out in the late 80s called Panhandling as a Profession. And there were guys that took it seriously.
Yeah, they're good. Some people. We even saw a llama on the street corner. They had a baby llama and some gypsy-looking people panhandling money. I guess it worked. I don't know. Major intersection here. By the way, that what Kelly just said, you can find in Hebrews 3:8-11 about hardening not our hearts. The more we trust God, the more our heart will be soft and open to God.
It's like when the physician comes in and says, "I've done everything I can do. You're in God's hands. Thank you." God created me. He made every piece of me. I like being in God's hands. A lot of people don't realize, they don't think about it, but He's your Father, and that's not just a word. He truly is. You know, a couple of you gentlemen got to meet my physical father at the feast this year, and he's a terrific guy, but he ain't God. God is he created the very, I don't know where to even go to what essence of a man, you know, of a human being. So when they tell you you're in God's hands, well, thank you. I think that's probably a wonderful place to be.
Yeah, they always use that as a last resort, and there's really they kind of use it as there's no hope, but well, that's not the right way to look at it at all.
I had someone come and tell me that they had some kind of pain in their stomach. They went to the hospital. The doctor came in. They did some kind of ultrasound or something. They saw, I think it was gallstones, said they were going to have to do surgery. And the man was in a lot of pain. And he said that he just started praying. And he said he started feeling better. The doctor came in and he says, I'm not hurting anymore. And the doctor says, well, I'm pretty sure he had the measurements of it because they can measure it's this big by that big. He says, no, I think I'm okay. I'm doing better. And he said the doctor came in and did the ultrasound and checked and could not find the gallstone. And he said, I don't know what to tell you. It's some reason it's gone. And the guy said, well, I appreciate spending my morning with you, and he went home.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean, you can't have a better person taking care of you than God. I mean, it's just like the Feast of Myrtle Beach. We had a hurricane coming up through, and people were kind of watching that, and you know, it turned and came nowhere near Myrtle Beach. I mean, the closest it got was like 300 miles off the coast. And some people said, well, but that's just nature. That's just, you know, no, that was God turning the hurricane away from a feast site and moving it out to ocean. Now we got a lot of rain. There was flooding around, but where we were at, there was no flooding. I mean, the waters never closed the roads off. Now, if you went out away from us some, there was some roads that were closed and stuff, but I know people that went out and they got to where they were going. We had some friends who were up in North Myrtle Beach who came down and made it to visit with us while this rain was going on. I know people who left and they were talking about all the roads being closed and stuff, and there were people who left and made it out without any problem. You know, there was one I know of that left during the storm and kind of got stuck moving forward and couldn't come back, but they turned out okay. But you know, I mean, even when it's pouring down rain and stuff, and the water's, this rain's coming in sideways, and people are getting all nervous, and you know, are you safe? I'm going, of course I'm safe. How can I not be any safer? God is going to take care of it. And if the ocean comes up and swallows me up, it was the best thing that could happen to me. You know, I mean, that's how we look at it.
With that.
Huh?
Some people, you know, wouldn't argue with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
Looking back at the whole situation, the people that panicked and were trying to, but almost was taking it out of God's hands, were the people had the most issue. The people that just didn't seem to think twice about it, didn't bother with it, didn't have much issue. You know, people got all nervous and bent out of shape, but they weren't thinking that, you know, they weren't putting it in God's hands and just ignoring the problem. I don't know, obviously you don't ignore it if the water starts rising. You got to do something.
Right? Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
the plane, the helicopter, and all that. But
Yeah. That old joke. Yeah.
stressed out over it. You know what I mean?
But yeah, I mean, but the thing, you shouldn't stress out over it because God will take care of it. I mean, He's going to take the best outcome that could happen as long as you follow. God's going to show you where to go. You're going to see the plane or the boat and realize, okay, I need to get in the boat, I need to get in the plane and leave, and you know, do that. But there's no reason to stress over it. It's just to trust God that He'll take care of it and come through with His promises. And you know, sometimes we look at things and go, well, that was terrible. That person died or something. I've always wondered, is it really? I mean, maybe the fact that they died prevented them from suffering for months on, you know, because we, being human, didn't want to see them go or didn't want to let go of us for our own selfish reason, but we weren't thinking about what pain they might have been in. And then we think, you know, well, God didn't heal them. Well, maybe it's because if God had healed them, it would have been worse on them on down the road. And He actually was merciful by letting them go ahead and die.
And I was talking to Ted Cotton, a wonderful man in the Atlanta church, and we were talking about somebody who we both knew and loved a lot, and he died, and Ted said, don't feel bad for him. You and I may still have to see the tribulation. God loved him, and he he was a good guy. Maybe
Mhm.
God just said, you know what? Why make him see the tribulation? The whole point, I think, is that the children of Egypt had a physical man, Moses, and we don't. There was a physical man, Jesus Christ, but he brought us into the spiritual time to where we don't need a physical man like that now because we can go directly to Christ,
Mhm.
which is what Moses symbolized by being dual like that. He said, I'm going to take you from this evil. I'm going to give you these rules. You obey them, you live. You don't obey them, you die. And a man will come like me who's going to take it to the next step to where we don't just have physical life, but we can live eternal life by the example Christ set for us by coming back to life on the third day. And people witnessed him. And what a lot of people don't understand is that Christ was alive before that, and he was alive after his physical death, and that others, not just the biblical writers, but others witnessed him that wrote about it and documented that he was back alive after the crucifixion. That hasn't happened with other religious gurus, leaders, prophets, or whatever. He's the only one.
Mhm.
Yep. Well,
By the
we've
way, I'm
kind
gonna
of
just
steered
clarify
this
something.
off.
Ke-
I'm sorry.
To
Go
Kelly,
ahead, Dr. Rick.
you all guys have all 8 of your services in spite of the heavy rain
Oh
Yes.
yeah.
in Myrtle Beach.
Yeah. We had no interruption in services whatsoever.
I just want.
Our
I remember
our atten-
that.
our attendance dropped off a little bit, where there were some people who went ahead and left, but you know we met right on.
You know, growing up in the church, we camped out in Jekyll Island, Georgia. And it was not uncommon for us to have a threat of a major hurricane or a tropical storm or something like this. I remember one year that we had to take our tent down and go stay at a motel. God protect us. I remember rain. I remember sitting in the big tent with Herbert Armstrong and Garner Ted Armstrong talking to us, and the wind rushing through and picking the stuff off the floor, and the water was going across the floor. Um, and coming down through these giant telephone poles that held this tent up, and everybody just cuddled up together. And then we went to our cars and we went back to wherever it was we went next. And God spared us every year. And so somebody tells me there's a hurricane coming, especially during the feast. I pray about it because I know if I ask God, He's going to take care of it.
Mhm.
We've got to have that faith through every part of our life, not just a hurricane.
By
Yeah.
the way, I remember looking at the weather maps as miraculous. For days and days, they all had it projected going to North Carolina, and of course, Myrtle Beach is on the North Carolina border, so you would have been right close to the middle of it. Then they moved it up to Virginia, and then all of a sudden, it was not going to hit any of North America at all, going out to the ocean. It's like it was a sudden change.
Mhm.
You did that, Kelly.
Yeah. No, it did, and it was. I was looking at. I had a radar app on my iPad, and I was watching the rain that was coming in, and it was interesting to see how the rain would come in, and it honestly it would divide over Myrtle Beach. It would split and then come back together behind Myrtle Beach, and it hit the inland. It hit the inland pretty bad. I mean, there was some flooding and there was some damage that was done, but right where we were at, just about the whole time until there was one day that as they refer to it as the fire hose, started moving up the coast, and it started and it hit Myrtle Beach, and probably for about 4 hours we had good solid rain. But even within that, the hard rain would lighten up, and and just kept passing. And I watched that on the radar, and I watched how fast it moved because it had been sitting over Charleston. It had just sat there and not moved. But when it started moving, it moved quickly, and it passed probably about 3 or 4 hours. And we had some hard rain at that point in time. It was raining sideways. I know at one point in time, I think Ken had to go out in it, and he was like wet down one side because it was just hitting him from the side. But you could watch the radar, and it was just, to me, I was sitting there looking at that and going, it's like the Red Sea party. It just parted and went around where we were at. And we just didn't. We had a lot of rain, but we just didn't have the flooding that they were having in other places. And I don't care what anybody wants to say. As far as I'm concerned, that was God protecting His peace side.
It's great that you said that because when I was a kid at Jekyll Island camping out, There was I don't know what year it was. I was either 7, 8 years old, something like that. There was a hurricane coming, and it was like the upper part kind of went off on its own, and the lower part went out, and it went around the area and came back together and formed a hurricane again. And when you're a kid, you hear the grown-ups talk about it, but you don't really get it. But I remember them talking about that, and they said it basically just split, went around us, and came back together. Hit a different area and was done. So.
And by the way, Ken wasn't wet on one side and dry on the other. I was soaked to the bone on one side and perfectly dry on the other. It come down sideways. I mean, the rain was just coming just sideways, just as hard and as fast as it could.
It's like just not turning in the shower.
We still have one section we didn't cover yet, and that is the symbolism of Moses as a model for the final two witnesses. And I think we might want to get to that before we close out. Dr. Ricks, if you wanted to start on that.
Maybe just mention it real briefly. We can talk about some later date. But in Revelation 11:3-6, the two witnesses will have carte blanche the power that Elijah and Moses had. Moses was able to turn major waterways to blood. Elijah stopped the rain. Those are the kind of things that are mentioned of the two witnesses. And just to the extent that it's an example to us, Moses left the Babylon of his day, Egypt. We should leave the Babylon of our day, which is the world's religion, but it's going to get worse. I mean, I believe the man of sin and some great deceptions lie right around the corner. The time to get out is now.
Yeah.
Yes. Things are getting worse, and I feel that my personal opinion is there's a time coming when there will be a snapback off of all the things that are going on, and there will be a religious factor that will come into it to try and straighten out the mess that the world's in. And I think at that point in time that religious system that will be set up will turn on God's people because we will not be tolerated.
Yeah, I've thought that for years, that things will snap back in the other direction. I mean, we're told that when the beast comes, he would fool even the elect's sake if it wasn't for God's intervention. The only thing that could fool the elect people, the people chosen, would be something that snapped back more conservative, more reasonable, away from what we're going to now, and that would be what would throw up my radar if I see that happening, because that's the only way it could fool even the elect's people. It would be something that would go along those lines.
And a couple of ways of looking at it is this new, and I hate to use the word pope, but that's the only thing he's known by, is running so to the left of everything that maybe he gets everything in a really mess, and the new guy comes along and he says, no, we've seen what doing it that way is like. We're going to fix it now, and watch these miracles I can perform. I sit in the very seat of God. And he starts fixing these things. However, he does not like the people who keep the Sabbath and the holy days and those things. And that would set all of that up. And one other little thing I want to mention before we get way off is one of the last things that happened when Moses took the people out of Egypt representing sin was sin followed them. It was hard to get away, and God had to put a pillar between them and the Egyptians. And then they went through the Red Sea mimicking a baptism. And a lot of people may be borderline considering baptism. And maybe this is time to get some counseling done and to really be serious and faithful about that baptism, because you're never going to get away from that sin and into the promised land without that forgiveness and the washing away of sins that represented.
Yeah.
I'll just say this time, since you brought up baptism, we had 2 baptisms in Myrtle Beach, and I am happy to say that I got to baptize my sister in Myrtle Beach, even with all the rain and everything. So,
by the way,
it's got to feel great.
As far as prophecy goes, according to Fox News, but I believe it's reasonably accurate, the Russian military general told us They were taking over the airspace over Syria, and the U.S. military has been more or less told in diplomatic ways to stand down. If any Russian fighters are in the area, to get out of their way, get out of the country. The Russians are now in control of that airspace, and it appears that the pride of America's power is going, and maybe it's not gone yet, but it's on its way gone. The Russians are bullying us, and not so much we can't stand up to them. I just don't. They know we don't want to bother. I guess that's the best way to put it. And now with America exiting the Middle East, that vacuum will bring in more evil that will eventually lead to the king of the South. And my other thought, and then you all can tell me what you think, is that as the Middle East gets more troubling and the U.S. is nowhere to be relied on, Israel will have more problems in the future, and one day we'll have to rely on God and rebuild the temple. That's my prediction.
The Middle East is turning into the wild, wild west. I mean, it's kind of there's no one in charge over there anymore. No one to enact a kind of a policing of that area and kind of hold these people in check. A couple of days ago or yesterday, maybe it came out that there's a huge oil field in the Golan Heights. They found it somewhere in the Golan Heights. Syria they still claim the Golan Heights as their own. They never have given up the fact that Israel took the Golan Heights from them, and they still hold on to it. Now you got Russia inserting themselves into the whole Syrian thing with this huge oil field that they found. I guess it's massive. This is all going to play into this stuff. If right now the Saudi Arabians are driving the oil prices down to get these shale companies, to bury these shale companies over here, so maybe someone can buy them up and pull them away from the people that have them now. But this oil isn't going to stay down long. If it jumps up $150, $200 a barrel, all of a sudden that huge oil field in Israel comes into play, Russia comes into play in Syria. It's just a mess. And now what? Iran tripped over a huge cache of uranium they found. I mean, it's just insane what's going on over there right now.
They just tripped over it.
Yeah, they just tripped over it. Oh, look what we found. Yeah.
And the other thing about Iran is if we start buying a tons of oil from the Iranians, that's going to upset where we've been buying the oil, and that's going to create more imbalance. It's eggshells.
Yeah. It's all simmering over there right now. We're starting to see things are getting clearer and more in focus of how this could all play out.
And like I've always thought, America was a benevolent stabilizer of the world. When that benevolent power recedes, what will replace it will be evil and violent. And we can see ever since we started pulling our troops out of Iraq and all those other pullbacks and apologies, the Middle East has been falling apart fast and furious.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about we have the last of the 10 Commandments next week, the 10th Commandment. That is accurate, right, Ken?
I believe so.
The 10th Commandment next week.
Look back in my archives here just to make sure, but I believe that's what it was. Here we go. Yeah, 10th Commandment. And then actually after that we go into Joshua. So, and I don't know. Everybody have a good feast? I know I did.
Yes.
It was a very good feast. A very good feast that we broke a record, and because the people were so generous, we broke a record in Branson.
Really?
And
attendance was up all over the place from what I'm told as well.
that shouldn't mean that the feast was.
Oh, you dropped off. We couldn't hear you.
think you
No,
froze
I'm
up.
not getting.
Feast
I'm not getting your
was
audio,
up in
Dr. Rick.
Branson. Yeah, the feast was up in Branson, and I think we and there was some new families there and new people, and that's always good news. Anyway, all good news is good news, and most
Good
that
news.
we got Golden Corral to cater our various meals, and it was much better than the other guy. It's an
Oh, you
outside
got Golden
caterer.
Corral to catering? Oh man.
I
Golden
went to the
Corral
wrong feast site.
Yeah, we need to hit Branson.
I went all the way to the other corner of the country and didn't get that. After we're off the year, I got to tell you about where we stayed.
All right, are we about? Have we concluded this tonight? Anything anybody else wants to add before we sign off? I guess not. Well, with that said, we're going to say goodnight, everybody. We're glad y'all watched. I think maybe because of the feast, we might have had some new viewers tonight, and I'm glad to see that you've made it. And we always appreciate everybody that watches. And remember, you can always send emails, lineuponline2810 at gmail.com if you have any suggestions or questions. And we also have our Facebook page. If you go onto Facebook and look up Line Upon Line 2810, you can find us there as well and leave comments or any suggested topics you'd like to hear. So, and we refer to that. So, again, thank you, gentlemen, and thank you everybody for watching tonight. And always remember, seek first the kingdom. And we're going to see if we can't get this video to play without too much trouble. We just need audio now.
We're happy you could make it. So glad you are here, and hope that we've been able to make God's word more clear. Until next time, may God be with you in everything you try. But for now, till next week, we have to say goodbye.
Good night, everybody.
Good
Good
night.
night.